Okay, well, I'll introduce you now to what's going to be an interactive panel discussion on how journalists work and how to help them make science into news. It's going to be chaired by Kylie Walker here, who is a communications professional with more than 18 years' experience in strategy, media and advocacy. After more than 10 years in journalism with a strong focus on medicine and science, Kylie left the Federal Parliamentary Press Gallery to handle media and publications for the Australian Medical Association and then Catholic Health Australia. She's now Director of Communications and Outreach at the Australian Academy of Science. Kylie is going to then chair the session and introduce everybody else, and I will get off the stage.
Thank you, Russ. It has been about 10 years since I was in the press gallery, so I think it's probably useful to hear more from the people who are there still and have been there for a long time. To my left is Lyndall Curtis. She's the political editor of ABC News 24. She's a veteran of the press gallery, having been there for about 25 years now. She's been chief political correspondent for ABC Radio Current Affairs, ABC Radio News, and she also ran the ABC's Canberra newsroom for a while, so very well versed. And to my right is James Massola. James is the political correspondent for The Age and Sydney Morning Herald, and he has previously done a similar job at the Financial Review and The Australian. He's been in the press gallery for around 6 years. So I thought we might start by asking each of these two seasoned journalists to talk about a day in the life of, and I'm going to ask James to start with a day in a newspaper newsroom.
Hi everyone. I guess what I wanted to give you today is a bit of an overview of what we do, but also how news has changed and how that might impact on the stories that you'd like us to be writing about, the research that you're doing. So an average day for a newspaper journalist these days probably starts at 6:30 or 7 a.m, where you pick up the papers and several cups of coffee and start reading for the day. There's kind of a, although the importance of newspapers, the role that they play in distributing news is declining relative to other forms of media, newspapers still have the ability to kind of set the agenda for the day. So you have to read, read as widely as possible, particularly up here, because there are, every newspaper in the country has an office up there. So you start the day reading the papers. Fran Kelly at 7:30. If you don't listen to her on Radio National, I'd encourage you all to do so. ABC Radio AM. Usually you're at your desk by about 8:30. Our bosses, our local Canberra boss, chief of staff, wants us to have an idea of what our stories are going to be by about 8:30 or 9 in the morning. So we list them in a sort of an internal system. So, for example, this morning I said, I wrote a couple of notes saying, shorten 9:30 on science, House inquiry into the Chinese market, basically, or Chinese investors buying into the Australian property market. Now, at this stage of the day, I have no idea whether either of those stories are actually going to be worth putting in the newspaper.
James, who sees that?
Oh, sorry. So that goes round to the Canberra Chief of Staff. That goes to probably 8 or 9 editors in Sydney and in Melbourne. So there are sort of parallel or concurrent newsrooms, if you like, in both, which can be a bit of a nightmare sometimes as they have different priorities. So, once these stories have been listed, you then go out and actually, for example, come to this event, you start making phone calls, you start getting a sense of whether or not this is actually a story, essentially. Through the course of the day, of course, everything can change. And I think this particularly goes to the way that newspapers have changed in the last 5 years or so. When I started in the press gallery 6.5 years ago, you'd write 1 or 2 stories a day for the newspaper, and that was it. Today, there's an expectation, not an unreasonable expectation, that we're all online reporters as well as print reporters. So, for example, when I finish here, I'll probably go back and write an online version of Bill's speech and say, Bill Shorten has promised to be a champion of science and what have you, make some calls on that and work out whether or not it's worth trying to put up in the paper. Newspapers have finite space, obviously, and online has infinite space, which is one of its benefits.
So does that mean that you have to lobby the editor to get a story into the print version?
To some extent, yeah, you do. You make a judgment call and think, well, this is a really good story, so I'm going to push hard with the day chief of staff in Melbourne and in Sydney. I'm going to push hard with what we now have called topic editors. So we have federal political topic editors, and then with the night editors as well. You start lobbying them at about 3 or 4 in the afternoon and saying, come on, this should definitely be on the front, or, this is not my finest work, but you should think about putting it in the paper. So I guess when I started, I'd probably would have written maybe 500 to 1,000 words a day. That's 2 page lead length stories. These days we're called upon on an average day pretty regularly to write between 2 and maybe 4,000 words. Sometimes there'll be a comment piece, an analysis piece, and stories that will come up at 4 p.m. that you haven't even thought about at the start of the day, whereas you've actually written other stories already. So it's a bit more of a movable feast these days.
So James, I take it that the deadline for the for the online version is pretty much all the time.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as a deadline, or alternatively, it's always deadline.
Yeah.
For the print version, when do you need to have your stories in by?
Stories coming out of... So there are 2 conferences. I should have explained this earlier. There's a 9:30 a.m. conference where all the editors in Sydney and Melbourne sit around and say, what have we got? What's a potential story for the front? What are we going to do further into the book, into the newspaper? And then at 3:30 or 4, they argue about it and work out what actually is going on the front. So if you're not on the front page, usually you have to have your stories filed by about 4:30 or 5. If you're on the front page, it's usually around 6:30 or 7. Deadlines used to be later, but the cost of doing that is essentially forcing newspapers to bring their deadlines back to earlier in the day, which is unfortunate because the challenge newspapers face is to continue to be relevant and to tell you when you get out in the morning and pick up the paper, something that you don't already know.
So it sounds like, to a large extent, the stories that are going to be in the newspaper are determined, about mid-morning?
Usually mid-morning. I mean, there are many things that can change it. If Tony Abbott gave a speech at 6 p.m. saying, I resign, you'd probably hold the front page. But generally speaking, by about midday, you know where you're going with a story. You don't know how good it's going to be necessarily, but it changes over the course of the day, and you try and make it as good as possible, as interesting as possible, as controversial as possible, all the elements that make up a good story.
Okay, thank you. Now, I know that the advent of online journalism has perhaps brought the worlds of print and broadcast a little closer together than they used to be, but Linda, would you tell us about the differences? What's your newsroom day like?
I do spend a lot of my time these days welcoming my print brethren to the world of effectively radio news, where I spent most of my career, where our deadlines have always been at least every half an hour and shorter than that when something's happening. In essence, in some ways, the way we structure our day is not all that different. There are 2 news conferences a day for both ABC radio and TV news. They are now joint news conferences. We get a note sent out at night time saying what is expected the next day, what things are already scheduled. We'll know follow-ups to stories that have been running the day before, court cases that are happening, conferences that are on. All those things are scheduled, and like a newspaper, they may or may not make their way onto the main radio news bulletins, into the main radio current affairs programs, or TV news and current affairs programs at the end of the day. Some things that have really changed, particularly in the ABC with the advent of News 24, which I work for, is the ability to do rolling breaking news. So an afternoon show can have, say they've decided to focus on a topic because it was looking like a light day, and maybe they've decided to do science, and they line up a couple of people, and then all of a sudden a plane goes missing in Malaysia. And every single plan they have, an interview they have, goes out the window to cover the breaking news story. So in journalism, planning only takes you so far, because then you have to deal with what happens during the day. And the stories that we identify the night before or in the morning's news conference may make it to the 7 o'clock news, may make it to the 7:30 report, or they may not at all. In some senses, you start out trying to plan your day, but in journalism, things that come up will knock a story off. Like newspapers, TV news bulletins, the radio current affairs programs, radio news programs are all constrained by time. When you look at, say, a 7 o'clock TV news bulletin, there aren't actually that many stories that make it into a news bulletin. So things will drop out during the day and other things will come onto the agenda. Radio news tends to have more time to play with, because they can evolve a story during a day or bring up something new during a day. The internet is infinite, so if something is interesting but may not necessarily make it onto, say, a radio current affairs program, but they've done an interview, they can always give that interview to online. So the news can get out somewhere, even if it's not on the main channels. One of the things I would like to leave you with is when people think about the media, they often think about the really high rating programs, about the TV newses, about the newspapers, about the 7:30 reports and the late lines. But if you look at, particularly in radio, and for, say, the 24-hour news channels, for ABC News 24 and Sky, there's a lot more scope to get a message out there that's not necessarily the biggest rating, but you can get a message out on ABC local radio. You've got something interesting to say, maybe talk to your ABC local radio station, and they can pass on interesting interviews to other local radio stations. The same for commercial radio. They've got hours and hours to fill every day where you can approach them, and the same for the TV, the 24-hour TV stations. We have 24 hours a day to fill. So we, there is space and time to do stuff that won't necessarily make it into a TV news bulletin, but might be interesting and might be worth doing, and the audience, which in the end is the people we serve, would be interested in.
Lyndall, you raise an interesting point and I'd like to explore it. What makes a story worth doing? Now, I know working at the Academy that I frequently, almost every day, come across very worthy pieces of information which are very important but are not necessarily going to be suitable for placement in the news somewhere. Can you talk through what it is that makes a story newsworthy rather than worthy?
Now you get into the dark arts of journalism. We do have a list, and we do every year, we have a cadetship program and they get presented with packs of information, and there's a list probably of about 20 things which go to newsworthiness. And they're taught in universities to journalism students, things to do with the impact on people, the effect on people, whether people are interested or not. Proximity is a big one, which is always the argument about, why we treat a big accident in Australia more seriously than we treat a, big accident in Bangladesh. Timeliness, has it just happened? Has it been around forever? In the end, though, it is a bit of a dark art. It's not a science. It's much more like economics than science. I love sledging economists at science functions. It's sometimes very hard to explain. That it's something that after you've spent a long time in the business, you just know that a story is going to be interesting. But the impact, the effect on people is probably the biggest one. If it affects a lot of people, and it's often why you see, in terms of science stories, medical science stories make the news a lot more than other science stories, because medical science stories are very easy to say, there's this life-saving discovery which is going to affect everyone who has cancer, it's going to make them live longer, which, when you take into account the number of people that affects, is an enormous number of people. So that is often, that I think is the crucial one, the effect on people, and if people are going to be interested, whether there's an interesting spokesperson, whether the story can be sold in an interesting way.
So you talk about the dark art of journalism. I work for a whole other dark art of public relations and communications, and it is my job to try and convince you guys to put some stuff in the news. For the purposes of science, as you say, if you can make it relevant to the individual and make it timely, I think those are the two key things that I look for when I'm thinking about whether I can, in good conscience, call you guys up and say, hi, I've got a story for you. James, can you think of, I'm going to put you on the spot, can you think of any examples recently of science stories that have grabbed your attention?
Really?
You can say no.
You have put me on the spot, and look, I can't think of any, I must say, and I do actually have an interest in science. I think that science and journalism are really at cross purposes in some ways. Journalism is driven by conflict and crisis and blood and gore and all those sorts of things. Science is a far more worthy pursuit in many, many ways. But it's a more difficult story to tell. And there are, I think, two ways that science can be in the news. The obvious one is the sort of crisis science, if you like. Say the Fukushima nuclear disaster a couple of years ago. That was, suddenly everyone wanted to talk to a nuclear scientist and say, well, what does this mean and how does it work? And that's a sort of a very basic way, but to actually tell the good story of science is quite a difficult thing. I mean, in a newspaper, you've got to have a decent story to tell. You've got to ideally have some good graphics or pictures. Newspaper editors are always looking for pictures to illustrate a page. But even then, it can be hard to actually get a story into the paper, to be honest.
And in some ways too, James is right. Journalism's a lot more like politics. We like to deal in things that are black and white, and we deal in fairly short time frames. Journalism and politics do not deal well with shades of grey, and we should get better at that, at explaining why things are complex and why things are uncertain and why we don't have all the answers, or the people we're speaking to don't have all the answers now, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We're also not good at dealing with really, really long time frames. But I think one of the interesting things for science, I spoke about medical science before, but ordinary people now interact with science a lot more than they ever did. We're all carrying around at least one piece of technology in our bags or pockets, and I carry around 2, often 3, because I'm a bit of a technology lover. We all have smartphones and iPads. We get into cars which have much more technology in them than they ever did. My 9-year-old, if I wanted to buy a 9-year-old boy an expensive piece of technology, which I don't necessarily think is a good idea, they're taking iPads to school. So people actually now interact with technology, interact with science a lot more than they ever did. And I think for scientists, there are a lot more jumping off points into the lives, to intersect with the lives of ordinary people, of people living their daily lives who might know nothing about science but use it all the time now.
One of the other points you brought up was proximity, and I think that's another thing that I look for. If I have a report on the impact of spreading suburbia on Melbourne's peri-urban grasslands, I'm going to go and talk to the Melbourne Press. I'm not going to call you up and say, hey, I've got a story for you. So I guess it's about sort of sorting where the interest might lie. And there's an awful lot of local media that I think gets forgotten often in this race for 7:30 and race for the front page of the Australian. So it's certainly worth keeping in mind.
And it's good too, some of the say targeting local radio stations or local newspapers actually gives you more time than you would necessarily get on a 7:30 report or in a 2-minute or 1.5-minute TV news story, or even space in a newspaper that is, dropping things because it doesn't have that much space anymore. You get, say you do an interview on ABC local radio, you might get 5 or 6 minutes or 8 minutes. Same for, say, a News 24 interview, particularly when I'm doing it and I'm not being disciplined about time. You get more time and you get to sell your message directly, not chopped up into little bites for quotes for a newspaper or sound bites for a TV news. In some ways, while I wouldn't necessarily take Bill Shorten's route and advocate that you all become politicians, that's what politicians do as well. They want to get their message out unfiltered, have time to explain it, so they will often choose the medium of local radio or talkback radio and go, as they like to say, over the heads of press gallery journalists, where their messages might get chopped into little sound bites and filtered.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up to you guys to ask any questions that you might have. I want both of you to have a think about any absolute howlers that you've come across, some really, really poor examples of people trying to get their face or their news or their piece of research, or it doesn't have to be science, into the news media. What are the ways that they do it badly?
Look, not something I experienced firsthand, but a kind of an apocryphal story that I heard a couple of years ago at Science Meets Parliament, which I think always bears retelling. A friend of mine working at the Herald Sun newspaper tabloid in Melbourne was interviewing a scientist who had, and I'm going to get the science wrong, but basically this scientist was working on an experiment that allowed, please forgive me if I get this wrong, allowed matter to be shifted from sort of one point, opened the door for matter to be shifted from one place to another. And she said to him, so it's like
I just did.
But they have done?
I just shifted.
Oh, you just
matter.
said, yes, sorry. In a way like a commute in Star Trek, essentially. It was sort of opening the door to that, right? And she said to him, so this sounds like something from Star Trek. And he said, well, no, it's far more serious than that. This has the potential to do this, this, and this. And he said, yeah, but this sounds like something from Star Trek. And they kind of went back and forth for about 5 minutes about it. And sure enough, the next day in the newspaper, in the Herald Sun, it was, scientists are on the verge of inventing Star Trek-like technology, and the scientists couldn't figure out why. And I guess it's an amusing story, but really the point of that story for me is you guys work on really complex equations or research or whatever it may be. Newspapers have to dumb things down, and that doesn't mean that we're trying to oversimplify your work. And as Lyndall said, we should be better at telling or explaining the shades of grey that exist in science. But in a finite space, in 300 words or 500 words, there's only so much grey that you can actually get across. So if you wake up the next day and you see a story, you think, oh my God, it's nothing like that. It's far more complex than that. There's a reason why. And the journalist in question is not necessarily trying to oversimplify or change the meaning of what you're doing. In fact, most of us probably our motivations come from a pretty good place, I'd say. But there's only so much you can convey in 300 or 500 words.
James, why don't journalists send their stories back to scientists to fact check before publishing? No. I'm not suggesting that they should. I'm just curious to hear the motivation.
I don't think that's a science. I'm amazed that there's applause here. Clearly there's a few people who've actually had bad experiences. I'm sorry to hear that. Print journalists, online journalists, we work, with tremendous time pressures, particularly for online. It's literally a matter of time. And secondly, as a sort of point of pride, we never send our stories to anyone. It's not just scientists. It's basically a kind of a principle about editorial independence and not someone sort of saying, oh, hang on, I don't want this, I want it to say that. I mean, if someone rings up, we might call people back to check a quote, but we won't let anyone influence the story. That's the principle at play, not so much we're trying to do you in, but we're trying to be independent and fearless, and this is how we see the story, and no one can tell us any different. That's what it's about.
And in some ways, some preparation work before you go into an interview, before you do an interview, can help deal with a lot of that stuff. Think about how you're going to explain it to people and where the complexities are. How you can educate the journalists so the journalists can educate the public. Can you get it down to a short page of dot points? Can you anticipate the Star Trek question and how you're going to deal with that? And does the Star Trek question actually help you sell your message? Or do you have to figure out how to differentiate? It's again a bit of what politicians do, is in fact wargaming what you're going to face before you go and face it.
And, part of that preparation might be talking to someone like me, and most of you, I'm sure, work at institutions that have PR people and communications people and journalists, in fact, on staff, and they can certainly help you anticipate the kind of questions that you're going to be asked. Has anyone here got a question for James or Lyndall? The gentleman here. Would you mind giving us your name, please?
Yeah, I'm Jeff. Is it on? Yes, my name's Jeff Prince. You've talked quite a bit about news stories and the time imperatives to go with news stories. But what about features and analysis? So if you read the Fairfax papers, for example, on the weekend, you have the impression that Australian intellectual life is dominated by the arts. Can you make any comment about that and why science doesn't have a higher profile in the features parts of those newspapers?
Probably twofold. We do actually have a science reporter down at the Age in Melbourne and one in Sydney as well. The Australian no longer has one, sadly.
I think there are maybe 3 in all of Australia now.
Yeah, it's as simple as that. There's not many science reporters around. There's plenty of arts reporters around. Maybe there's a predilection among journalists who have done arts degrees and not science degrees. I think it's as simple as that. Newspapers put resources where I guess readers' interests are, as sad as it is to say, and it's easier to tell a story about a play or a movie, arguably, than it is to sort of decode and explain new research. That's not an answer that you're going to like, I'm sure.
I'm not so sure I agree that more people are interested in plays than in science. I mean, Lyndall's just talked about a really terrific example of how interested people are in science with all of their technology, their bits and bobs. I also am curious to know, and I don't know that anyone's actually going to be able to give me the answer to this, why we have a daily economics report on pretty much every news bulletin, but not a daily science report.
Because I think it's how it affects people's lives is pretty...
Does it though?
Money. The world revolves around money. You can't do anything without it. in the end. That's why economics dominates politics. 'Cause
Does the value of the Australian dollar overseas really have a day-to-day effect on the individual person? Isn't that,
I
a
think
big
it sometimes
business?
hasn't. Well, you can look at manufacturing and say absolutely. You look at
Okay.
agriculture and say absolutely. I think the thing with scientists getting messages out is that arts people, particularly say when you're talking about actors, tend to be very articulate because that's their job. Finding people who speak well, who speak with passion, and I cannot underline that enough. Speaking with passion about what you do, who are comfortable dealing with the media, and it takes time to get comfortable dealing with media, particularly broadcast media, because we tend to intimidate people with our technology by putting cameras in faces and setting up lights, and we're all cool with it because we've been doing it forever. But having people who can sell your case, and there are some really good ones out there, you only got to look at what Brian Schmidt's been doing in the last few years to sell the case not only of his particular branch of science, but science in general. Ian Chubb's a very good advocate for the cause of scientists, people who are comfortable with media, who deal with it very well. Another one in Canberra who's a particular favourite of the News Breakfast Show on ABC News 24, Charlie Lineweaver, who is fabulous. He's not your, polished professional suit-wearing person. He's much more what people might see when they think of a scientist, but he's really passionate about what he's interested in, and he involves the presenters and the audience with his passion. Those sorts of things, get some practice, figure out what you want to say, and learn to say it well, and learn to bring the passion you already have for your jobs and project that to people, I think advances your cause and gets your message in where it would not otherwise go.
With regards to the question about features and opinion pieces, I think one of the things that I would like to say is that that is an opportunity to develop perhaps more long-form journalism, but it requires a longer timescale and the building of a relationship, I suppose, and over time, finding somebody, a features editor or an opinion editor who has a particular interest or whose interest you can spark, and then work with that person to build the feature. And I think that works better for features than for opinion pieces, because op-eds like news are very dependent on the news cycle of the day.
But you can also use the thing that James talked about is scientists responding to news events, getting engineers to talk about planes or nuclear scientists to talk about nuclear accidents. You can actually use that, and it's often what politicians do and journalists do with politicians, is use those one-off news events to start building relationships with journalists. You ring the journalist you dealt with on the nuclear accident story because you've got something really interesting to say, and you might remember you talked to me about, I've got this thing to do. So you can actually use those news opportunities to build a longer-term relationship with a journalist or group of journalists that you can then use if you've got something that may not be hard news but might be interesting to tell them about it.
So two things to say in response to that. One is, yes, absolutely be proactive, and you don't have to wait to be called to give your side of the story. Probably three things, actually. The Australian Science Media Centre does this very well, and I know that Simon referred to that earlier. And the third thing is, don't be upset and never call again if, when you do call, your comment isn't able to be used. Just, try it again the next time. Have we got another question? I think building those long-term relationships, it's like anything, isn't it? If you know somebody, you're more likely to pick up the phone and have a chat to them.
Sure.
Hi, this is Mahesh Prakash from CSIRO. I was just curious to learn how often do you use crowdsourcing or social media to decide what's newsworthy?
Lyndall?
I think we look at it more and more, but I think deciding whether something's newsworthy, we wouldn't necessarily look at social media, but there are things that get a big hit on social media. I think we run the risk sometimes of getting captured, particularly by Twitter, by what's going on Twitter. And we actually have to be more careful to look at whether that's actually representative of the population or whether it's just representative of the people who are really, really interested and have time to bash out 140 characters. I occasionally do completely unscientific little research projects with the mothers of the children I go to school with, to see if any of them are on Twitter. And I have 3 children, I've found one other person who's on Twitter. So I don't know, we have to be careful with what is making a buzz in social media and whether that's actually a buzz, whether that's actually something that would interest the broader scope of the population that we're broadcasting to.
Yeah, I don't use it at all to decide whether or not to write a story about something. I think you have to back your own judgment. So this is what I'm going to do and this is where I'm going today. What I do use it for is, say for example, I'm writing a story about changes to penalty rates and there's a speech going on in the Parliament or a series of second reading speeches going on in the Parliament and I have to go and talk to someone or interview someone. I'll come back and say, okay, so-and-so says that Brendan O'Connor's just spoken, and then Chris Pine, and then Graham Perrott, and then Adam Bant. So I make sure that I can it helps you keep up to speed with things if you're away from your desk or if you're not in the chamber, but yeah, not in terms of making a judgment call at all.
It is, though, a really interesting way for, say, scientists to engage with journalists, because you can get us quite directly and have a conversation and have effectively a relatively intimate but public conversation, and we can get to know you because we interact with Twitter over something that was interesting, that you were interested in, and then all of a sudden something comes up in your area of expertise and I know you because I speak to you on Twitter all the time. We joke about the weather or the kids or whatever, and then I might say, can you help me out with this? So it's actually, as a method of engaging directly with journalists, I think it's a really interesting one.
Yeah.
And some people do it very well.
There's about maybe a dozen scientists that I met last year at Science Meets Parliament who I'm still friends with and talk to about various things. I'd caution against using Twitter as a judge of, an adequate judge of social mood. I think it skews left, and I think it's really, a lot of people, I don't know, either hard left or hard right, and something like 2% of Australians, use it. So I'm a bit wary of it in that sense.
We have another question over here, and so there's one behind you as well. Yep.
Selena Ward from the University of Queensland. I just wanted to go back to the scientists being able to look over the articles before they go in, because I think it's something that's important to a lot of us. And just to make the point that some journalists do that, and I wouldn't feel threatened for your fearlessness or think that scientists are trying to influence you. It's just an opportunity to fact check, because I think a lot of us in the room would have examples of our work not being factually correct in the media, and that is always something that we're concerned about.
There's a couple of things I'd say in response to that. There's nothing I hate more than getting anything wrong, from spelling Philip with 2 L's instead of 1 through to actual facts that matter. And I think that would apply to most journalists. There's one in the climate change space. I can certainly understand any climate scientist being wary about some of the reporting that's gone on in the last 3 or 4 years, and if that, for example, for some of you here, is driving the desire to fact check, I particularly understand that. But I guess I'd go back to the other reason I gave, which is partly time pressures, and partly it's almost a matter of pride. Like, I make sure I don't make any mistakes, and if I think I'm unclear on something, I'll always call the person that I've interviewed back.
I was going to say, when I was a medical correspondent and I spent most of my time reading journal articles, and I'm not scientifically trained, I would, if I was confused or knew that I hadn't quite got what I was looking for, I would always call the person who I'd interviewed and just talk them through again what it was that I was planning to write. And I think that most journalists would do that. They, as James said, journalists want to get it right too. They're not in the business of spreading misinformation, despite what some people might say.
In an average, if I'm interviewing someone for a newspaper article, typically I'm sitting at my desk typing as we talk. I'd probably take 3,000 or 4,000 words of notes in a maybe 20-minute, 30-minute interview and use 2 of those sentences. So, and I think most journalists are like that. That's not extraordinary. You try and get as much information as possible, then work out what the story is, or you have an idea beforehand. But the likelihood of being misquoted is probably, I would have thought, less likely than perhaps a lot of the people in this room have a sense of.
I guess another point to that is, and it's something that I come across when I'm writing press releases or helping people write opinion pieces through the Academy, is that the way in which you might write or speak or be trained to write or speak as a scientist doesn't always match up with the way in which you might write or speak if you're writing for news. And so inevitably a story written by a journalist is going to have a different feel, a different skew perhaps to the one that you might write if you were writing as a scientist. So I think that where that mismatch occurs, it can be, as James alluded to, incredibly time-consuming to find the middle ground. And sometimes in a newsroom, there just isn't that luxury. Another question?
Marianne Large from the University of Sydney. So there's been a lot of discussion about scientists having their work presented through the medium of a journalist. What about the alternative scenario in which effectively the scientist becomes the journalist? I don't mean as a profession, but for example, contributing something to a newspaper like the Sydney Morning Herald or The Age, or in particular taking part in the conversation, which is a medium which is absolutely designed for professional researchers to be able to directly present their work to the public.
I think the conversation is really important, and it's becoming more so. It's a terrific collaboration between academics and journalists, and it really does find that middle ground that I've just been talking about between, getting your point across in a factually correct way and having that journalistic flair applied to it so that it's more consumable for a broader audience. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that more and more news media are looking to the conversation for ideas as well. I have heard that from several journalists. You may disagree.
I don't know, it doesn't tend to happen in the political space, but it's like what I was saying, don't just look at the big rating, high profile places to put your news. There's a myriad of places to have a conversation with the Australian public. Use the one that suits. Use the one that's going to get your message out, and you can do things like write an opinion piece for a newspaper or a website, or do something with the conversation. Then you can share it on social media, and if you've got some journalists who are friends, they might be able to share it as well, and you can get your message out very effectively that way. It's having the idea of where you want to pitch your story, what you want to say, and doing that to the best of your ability.
I know certainly in my role where I am charged with getting a really broad variety of both research and more policy-oriented science stories into the media every day, I always think about the suitability of the medium. So there will be times where I will only suggest that we go to the conversation. There will be times where I might call someone like James or Lyndall. There will be times where I might call the local newspaper in Toowoomba. It just really depends on the story and its provenance. Another question. I think there's one waiting back here.
My name's Paul Dux. I'm from the University of Queensland. I just want to get back to the topic of, obviously Twitter, you say, is not driving stories. But what about, science can be very global. We've talked a lot about domestic focus, but there's large news corporations that are involved in science reporting globally. I'm thinking of Science and Nature News, Scientific American, these sort of groups. To what extent is that grabbing the focus of what appears in local media? So much so, well, if it gets into Nature News, then it'll be reported on locally in a newspaper here. And I think in some ways that can put Australian scientists at a disadvantage. One, it's very hard to get into those outlets. Two, we're quite removed from, say, that market. And also even just practical things, like if they need someone to do an interview and there's a time difference, obviously they won't go to the Australian journalists. So I was just wondering, or the Australian scientists, I should say, I was wondering if you could make comment on that and the extent to which these major news corporations for science are really driving what's reported on.
I think they do a little bit, and you'll see it in some of the reporting. If it gets reported in a major journal, then people might pick it up in Australia. I don't know, I haven't looked closely enough to see if it's driving it to a major extent, though.
Yeah, I'd have to say the same thing. And you're probably asking two of the wrong journalists as well, I guess, because our focus is primarily politics, so it would be something that would come across our radar if it also intersected with the political sphere. So if there was a new report on climate science, for example, that would be something that would come across our desks. But more broadly about science, yeah, maybe not so much.
And also I would think too, for the journalists in Australia who perhaps aren't immersed in the day-to-day world of science, something having been published first in a journal like that might give it some credibility, and you have some trust in that you don't necessarily know from picking up a story in Australia from someone you've never heard of.
But it doesn't have to be science, and it doesn't have to be nature. There are lots of journals that get reported on and picked up, and the Australian Science Media again helps with that. You know, they put out a daily roundup of big stories, and if you are able to put out a press release under embargo perhaps, so that it coincides with the embargo of the journal, to say, hey, we've got this amazing piece of research that's been published in this peer-reviewed journal, then you're much more likely to have your story picked up than if you just publish it in the journal and cross your fingers and hope for the best. And I know that I get the Australian Science Media roundup across my, well, I'll say across my desk. It comes into my email inbox, obviously, every day. And there will be 10 or 15 stories about Australian science that's been published in a journal, in a peer-reviewed journal, pretty much every day. All of them interesting, all of them worthwhile. And the people who subscribe to that alert are the journalists who have an interest in science. So you know that they're going to be the ones most likely to pick it up if it's going to be picked up. Another question?
Hi, Claire Morgan from the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute of Medical Research in Melbourne. I guess I'm getting the sense clearly that journalists like conflict and to get at least two sides to every story in the interests of objectivity. I think in some areas of science the difficulty is reconciling that with the danger of giving legitimacy to essentially baseless opinions and propagandists. And I'm talking about climate change and the debate around vaccination here specifically. And I just wanted to kind of make the corollary that you don't ask someone in the queue at cash converters for an opinion on the latest decision by the RBA. So you're trying to force science into this certain type of template that you have for reporting, and is there a different way that we can approach it that injects the interesting aspects of science that are clearly there, so that they're clearly conveyed and communicated to the population at large?
I don't think in every story you're going to have a conflict model and be that model of balance represented. There are a lot of science stories that are presented as this is a discovery or finding by a scientist or group of scientists in Australia, and this is what it is, and there's no need for conflict and there's no need to find an opposing point of view. I think it happens in particularly controversial areas. In climate change science, it happened at the point at which the debate about climate science stepped over into a debate about what you do about it and the economics of it, and that stepped into a debate about politics, and everything got wrapped up together. The vaccination one is a really interesting curve of learning for journalists and media organisations about finding a group that was particularly vocal and well organised, who were anti-vaccination, but then going through who they were and what their evidence was, and then making decisions that that we won't be seeking them for comment anymore because they're not credible. So I think journalists are aware of the need to seek credible sources of information, and if there is a situation where there needs to be an opposing view, finding a credible, authoritative view on that. And, you know, we do occasionally speak to people in the queue of cash converters about the RBA's latest decision because it affects them.
I guess the other thing I'd say is that climate science has been poorly served by journalism in the last few years, basically. conflict does drive journalism. That's true. That's how we do things. Yeah, I've been fairly dismayed by some of the wingnuts who get an amazing run in certain newspapers, and I'm sorry to see it. And the Herald and the Age don't do it, and the ABC doesn't either. That's all I'd say. Yeah.
I will say as well on the issue of vaccination, and I've done a lot of work on this issue in the last 12 or 18 months, that the media has been incredibly supportive and has actually helped come to the point where the New South Wales Office of Fair Trading has ordered the Australian Vaccination Network to change its name to the Australian Vaccination Skeptics Network, which is only appropriate. So it's not always... I agree, James, on climate change. I think that it's been very, very unfortunate that it's been presented as a conflict model.
Yeah, Lyndall identifies correctly as well how that's happened. It's in the shift from a debate about policy and about the scientific response to when it's shifted into politics is when it's shifted into a conflict model, but I don't think that excuses how it's been covered, because I think there's some... we can't choose our own facts, we can choose our own opinions, but we can't choose our own facts.
So we have time for one or two more quick questions, and I think we've got one waiting over here.
Thanks, guys. Been really great listening to you guys and getting a bit of feedback about, I guess, how it's worthwhile as a scientist to try and put a bit of thought into how to communicate your message. It's a bit of a follow-on from the last question. I was very interested in your comment about getting more shades of grey into 300 words. And I completely agree, and it's not just a science issue, it's a political issue. Can you give an example or make some suggestions as to how you see Australian media actually being able to do that? Because I'm not unsympathetic to the problem, but I'd be very curious if you could elaborate.
In a way, I'd go back to the question from the lady over there earlier. I mean, I think it's a great idea for scientists to write opinion pieces. I think it's a great idea for scientists to blog. I think it's a really great idea for them to write for The Conversation, which is an excellent website, which I really enjoy reading, and I think more and more people do. And all of those are avenues, I guess, to get a sense of the shades of grey in scientific research out into the public domain. How you squeeze that into 300 words, I'm not sure, frankly. Online, again, to go back to something that Lyndall and I have both said, has an infinite space, and I will often get to a point where I've written 2 or 3 drafts or updates of a story through a day, and the story's 1,500 words long, and I have to cut it down to 600 or 300, and that's a bit of a pain, but the original longer version will stay online, and frankly, all the eyeballs are online these days. So I think we are kind of shifting towards platforms where we can have that grey illuminated and illustrated a bit better, but other than that, I'm not quite sure.
And in some ways, you can explore those shades of grey more in, say, an interview on a broadcast medium than you could in a newspaper article, where the presenter, the journalist, gets the chance to follow up and ask the question to try and draw out exactly where the complexity is and what it means. I have a saying I tell all young journalists I come across, that no question is too stupid. So you often get what may be stupid questions, but I always think if it occurs to me as a journalist on the fly, then that's probably what my audience is thinking as well. And I gave up understanding physics at the point at which my physics teacher told me that red wasn't really red, and I just went, oh, okay, I'm never going to understand this. But you can ask questions that might seem stupid to you, but are saying, okay, I don't understand this. How do you explain it? Let me follow it up, and that's your opportunity to say, well, it's not, it's not clear, and there are things we have to find out, and these are the things we don't know, but these are the things we do know as well, and this is why it's potentially really interesting.
I tell you what, actually, Lyndall, it's just occurred to me, one of the things that you can do if you're worried about fact-checking and you're brave is do live-to-air interviews, because you're not going to get edited.
No. And that's another thing the politicians do. They do the talkback and the local radio, and they prefer to do interviews. I know they prefer to do interviews with me live than a pre-recorded interview, because they know that might get sliced and diced, or it might get bits edited out of them, especially the boring bits.
We have time for one last question here at the front.
Okay, my name is Yalchin Oitam. As journalists, you'd be well aware of vested interest and how to deal with it. But scientists generally are not. And when we're talking to non-scientists, it's usually about some sort of a social topic with a social impact. And we might be opposed by someone with a vested interest who knows how to use the language. I mean, as a scientist, you've got to think about the message that you have got, and that the message that you've got constructed in a scientific language and translated to a, in the language of someone with sort of, normal experience. So you've got a lot going, whereas the person opposing you, they're only interested in sort of, the sophistry of it. So what's your advice for us there? How do we deal with it?
Wow.
I think someone's practice getting good at explaining your position, explaining your message. I often think that opinion is best countered by evidence, that you bring up evidence, and that's what science does well, is present the evidence. Sometimes it's a hard slog, and it's repeating yourself time after time and countering the argument each time it comes up. But you counter it with confidence and evidence. That helps in the long run. There's often a thing in politics that says as soon as the politician is sick of saying something or the journalists are sick of hearing it, that's when the public's getting the message. So just going out once and saying something doesn't necessarily make your case. You might think you made it particularly well, but you might have to go out and say it again and again, particularly if there's a very vocal group that speaks in opposition to your point of view or the evidence that you have.
I'd also like to add, phone a friend. Use Google, find out who's been talking about it before and who's done it well, give them a call. I know that Inspiring Australia has as one of its mandate, well, pretty much its central mandate, I think, apart from actually Inspiring Australia, is to get people to collaborate and to work together in the science and technology and engineering sectors. So there's no reason why you can't have a look at what other research institutes or other science organisations have said about this, and if they've done it well, give them a call and say, hey, what did you do? Why did it work? Can you give me some tips? Usually you'll find that people are very happy to respond.
And if you do have something that you're fighting against, and you're not the only person, politicians again like to get what they call third-party endorsers out to help them sell their message. If there are 6 of you in 6 different research organisations, you present that breadth of opinion, that breadth of evidence for your cause.
Yep.
It's what we did with immunisation last year. We had the Australian Medical Association, we had the Nurses Federation, we had scientists, obviously, from a whole range of different research organisations. We had some politicians. We had just lined up a really broad range of people who we knew we didn't have to convince because they were already championing the cause and said, hi, we want to do this thing, can you help us out? And it worked really well. Thank you very much, all of you, and thank you very much to Lyndall and to James. I think it's been very interesting, and I hope that you found it valuable too. Thank you.